Hello, everybody. It's really gives me a lot of pleasure to, so to speak, meet some of the quite large community that's grown up around the journal since we were founded 16 years ago. We've come a long way in 16 years, and I think built up a kind of a reputation for being seriously international and seriously interdisciplinary. We decided to start this series of webinars after 3 years ago, Pluto Journals took the very brave step of making the journal open access, which more than tripled our readership. So we now have a very, very large readership around the world. Unfortunately, those readers are not paying any longer to subscribe. So we're going to become more and more dependent on kind of voluntary support and membership schemes to keep going. But it's very exciting, the kind of interest that we've attracted. And we've decided to launch a series of webinars to try to create a broader community around the journal and get more kind of dialogue into the discussions between contributors to the journal and our readers. And our last issue, our most recent issue, we decided was a very good basis for this first webinar. All the speakers today are people who contributed to that issue, which was looking at the particular challenges of researching precarious and vulnerable workers. Now, this, of course, is not a new problem. I mean, 30, 40 years ago, when people like me were researching home workers, we realized that there are a lot of challenges, methodological challenges in finding samples and enormous ethical challenges in researching vulnerable workers. And this issue has become very popular again in the context of platform work, which has suddenly become an enormous research topic, which is growing very rapidly around the world. And our journal, I'm rather pleased to say, I just checked up yesterday. We actually started publishing about platform work in 2010. There was a pioneering article by Brett Carraway on the platform Odesk, right at the very beginning of the platform work phenomenon. I mean, companies like Uber and so on were actually not founded until 2011, 2012. So we've got among our larger community, we've got quite a lot of experience of researching platform workers. So today, our topic is the challenge of researching platform work, but not just for the researchers. We also want to give a voice to the platform workers who are studied in this new field of research that's opening up. So I'm going to pass you straight across now to our first speaker, who has not only got a lot of experience researching gender and technology and migration and other issues relevant to platform work, but has also looked at what gets left out in the research as well as what's included. So Nelly Kambori from Pantheon University in Athens is going to talk about, is going to kick off our discussion, talking about gender and platform work. So over to you, Nelly.
Okay, thank you, Ursula. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. I think the developments today make it even more exciting to talk about this issue. Now, I would like to start by saying a few words about why gender has been obscured, in my opinion, in the study of platforms, and why it is an area that has a lot of potential and many challenges to study in the future. I think that the intensification of labor struggles in male-dominated sectors, such as delivery and passenger transports, has no doubt turned the attention of researchers primarily to these male-dominated sectors. And it has been mainly the voices of male voices, male activisms that have come to the forefront. And this has been reflected in the fact that we have the predominance of the Uberization model in the ways in which we understand platformization as a process. And it might sound a bit ironic saying that today, after all the revelations about Uber and how it has worked, which give us a lot of insights into how platforms develop. But at the same time, I think it has also obscured less visible but equally important struggles in some other sectors that are more feminized and racialized, like those of domestic and care work. And we have examples like the National Domestic Workers Alliance in the US, or the agreement between, it was a collective agreement, a short-lived collective agreement between domestic work platform and the labor union 3F in Denmark, which show that even though developments in these sectors are not as spectacular, they are important. And in my view, to integrate gender in the study of platforms, we need to think about platform work in the context of broader genealogies of precarity. And it is important to think about how women and workers from the Global South perceive work. And contemporary precarious working conditions in digital platforms, for many of them, are not new, and they are not extraordinary. For many female and migrant workers in the Global North, and for most workers of all genders in the Global South, the Fordist paradigm of full employment and access to social protection was never the norm. So I think that we should include this into our understandings of platform work if we want to move forward with a more global perspective and also integrate gender. Now, shifting our focus towards a gender perspective also means, in my view, addressing the intersectional aspect of this of platform work. So it's not just a question of including female voices or including labor struggles in female-dominated sectors, but it's also about how platformization becomes feminized and racialized, and how we can become more attentive to intersectional inequalities of class, gender, race, and sexuality in the ways in which we understand platforms. And I think so far there have been several examples of how this can be done, but we can expand the ways in which we do it. And I think in the rest of this discussion, we can discuss in more detail how this can be done. And this ranges from quantitative studies where we can address intersectional indicators, but also use time use surveys, for example. But it's also a question of including other issues which are important. One issue, for example, which for us has proven to be very important, is unpaid reproductive labor, how we include unpaid reproductive labor. And it's interesting to note that this is not an issue just for women, just for mothers, just for female carers. But our research in London and Paris has shown that actually also a lot of male Uber workers have work-life balance issues. And there are a lot of questions about masculinities and how male workers cope with affective ties in their attempts to combine care with platform work. We have seen a lot of concerns about fatherhood and how you actually are able to juggle care time with work, especially when platforms put so much pressure on workers to seemingly be flexible, but in reality to be there all the time for the platform. And another final issue that I think it's important to address is affective labor, how affective labor is linked to algorithms, how it becomes oppressive and threatening, how it becomes internalized by platform workers who need to be constantly aware that they are subject to algorithmic control, to different types of evaluations by customers, which often include go beyond the mere platform and include also other media like social media, and integrate their social and private lives into the ways in which they are evaluated. So I think there are several challenges that come that we can discuss about regarding gender. But overall, while we are focusing on developments in platforms that may not be feminized and racialized, we also need to address how gender relations are being structured in these platforms, even if our topic is not female platform workers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nelly. I'm going to move on very quickly. We get a chance, I hope, to have questions at the end, to our next speaker, Funda Uzbek-Spilder from the Oxford Internet Institute, who have a large team of people researching platform work all around the world and have put a lot of thought into actually how you contact workers and how you do so ethically. So over to you, Funda.
Thank you so much, Ursula, for the introduction. As Ursula mentioned, I'm part of Fair Work. We are a research group that studies working conditions on digital labor platforms across the world. We currently have teams in 29 countries, and we also do research on cloud work, which is not, country-based. And this paper that we have written for the journal really came from our internal discussions with the team here at Oxford and in other teams about the ethics of doing research on digital labor platforms and specifically the recruitment practices of workers. Because as you know, depending on the type of platform work, the way to reach workers as for us researchers differs. With some workers, it is possible to use traditional methods of reaching workers, such as hanging around in restaurants and identifying delivery workers or courier workers by parcel depots, but this is not always the case for instance, domestic work platforms or care work platforms, as Nelly mentioned, because they are harder to reach. So when we were discussing our own research practices and as well as the kinds of recruitment methods and other sorts of data collection methods that are available, that are mentioned in other work by other scholars who study digital labor platforms, we realize that there's a tension between anonymity and and researcher transparency. So the whole paper is structured around this tension between anonymity of research participants, ensuring that confidentiality of research data is ensured, as well as the transparency of research aims as researchers when we talk to workers, when we engage with them. And the tension also arises from the fact that these three aspects are considered to be the basic tenets of research ethics and informed consent stated in research ethics guidelines without much problematization or further thought. The lack of further problematization also takes place because digital labor platforms and the digital interfaces, whether they are apps or websites or other kinds of interfaces that we need to deal with in our research, these are considered to be neutral, neutral platforms that just facilitate engagement of a client and a worker, or a researcher and a worker. Whereas in this paper, we problematize that presumed neutrality of the platform interfaces. And more specifically, we look at what these interfaces do when we use them in our research and how they affect the anonymity of research participants potentially, as well as what we can disclose as researchers in our research process. To give a very brief example, for instance, the main question arises from at what point as researchers do we disclose that we are reaching the workers through these platforms for specifically research purposes, or as clients of those platforms too, because we might also be genuinely clients hiring those services from the platforms. I might be using an Uber, I might be using a care work platform for to arrange childcare, but at the same time, that might also be a way for me as a researcher to identify a worker who works for those platforms, who I would like to get in touch with. So in this article, we look at what kind of problems arise and why these problems arise when we would like to ensure worker anonymity on the one hand, confidentiality of the data on the other hand, on the one hand, as well as the researcher transparency on the other hand. And we look at what kind of problems mainly there are, ranging from the very possible possibility of platforms being able to identify who we interviewed for our research project. Once they can identify us, once they can identify me, they can identify basically who I have talked to in a period of time, that is the research period, let's say, and that makes the workers very vulnerable and identifiable in our research. And if that is the case, if these are identifiable like this, what other methods then should we be using to make sure that the workers are not identifiable and they are not subject to any kind of risk from the platforms for retaliation, if especially we publish something critical about the platform as researchers. And we also discuss in this article that research workers might not always be in a position to be able to share the kind of details that we ask them to share as well. First of all, they might not always know the details. Second of all, there might be very in small print, for instance, platform conditions which tell them not to share any information, and these might have ramifications. And these can range from workers sharing us their contracts or images, screenshots of their of their apps or the website login sort of their version of the website that they see when they log on, or any other kind of information that they might want to share with us. So the onus is on us as researchers to also make sure that we do not put any workers at any risk, basically. And in this article, we also look at how the challenges of recruitment and engagement with workers are different in both geographically tethered work or location-based work, as others call it, and cloud work, online work platforms. Simply because the geographical proximity of the worker and the researcher might be very different, and the way of recruiting workers might be very different. For instance, on online work platforms, the research tasks are usually put on the platforms as a usual task, which means that the workers might need to, get in touch with the client, then becomes the researcher, becomes the client, to make sure that they get the job. So this, or the interview, this adds additional sort of vulnerabilities to the power dynamics that are between researcher and participants. The majority of the article is focused on mitigation strategies. These are not in any way meant to be sort of, suggest, like, we do not mean these strategies to be completely they do not completely override the possibility of some of the issues that we raise in the article, and we are aware of this. And they're not exhaustive as well, because we are aware that platforms use different operational business models, revenue models, and each of these create their own vulnerabilities in terms of ensuring the worker anonymity and researcher transparency. But they are the kind of good practices that we have developed throughout our research, because we have been thinking about these issues quite a lot. I will not go into...
Can I ask you to wind up now?
Yes.
Sorry to put pressure on you.
No, that's okay. I wasn't going into any detail of any of the mitigation strategies. I just wanted to end on just noting that basically, we are aware that as researchers, the dynamics of recruiting and accessing workers are changing through the digital labor platforms, and assuming or presuming anonymity will be there just because we are ensuring the kind of we are abiding by the certain research rules or guidelines that were established before may not always be enough. We need to continuously think about these kind of issues, and it's very important that we do so in relation with workers as well, and understand what kind of vulnerabilities that we might be exposing them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Funda, and sorry to rush you. I hope everybody will read the excellent article, which is free online in our most recent issue. And now across the Atlantic and over to Todd Wolfson from Rutgers University in the United States, who is not only a very experienced action researcher who has included research on platform workers, but is also in his own right a trade union activist fighting for academic workers in the United States.
Thank you. I'll say quickly, thanks to Pluto Journals and to Work Organization, Labor and Globalization. This is fantastic. And I want to thank Nellie Kamburi for her important comments on how gender is obscured in platform research, as well as Funda's comments on fair works research and ethical recruitment. I also want to take a minute just to say, Ursula, it's great to be with you. You've been a friend and collaborator for a long time. And of course, to say it's great to be on this with James and Yassine, James Farrar and Yassine Aslam, who have been friends and collaborators for a few years. So I'm going to try to keep my comments really brief. I want James and Yassine to have some space to really push us about what they've seen. They're leaders from App Drivers and Couriers Union, ADCU. And I guess what I want to join in I guess where Funda Ustek was bringing us about the fraught ethics of research on vulnerable workers. And it's really great to see Fair Works work on that front. And at the outset, I want to say that it's critical that scholars do a better job policing our own borders around the ethics of researching vulnerable workers, not only our own research, right, which clearly, as Fair Work has done a really good job outlining what they think is ethical recruitment. I think that's really important, but then there are other bad actors within the broader field, and scholars must be the ones to police the borders. We cannot expect the workers who are vulnerable to fight back against scholars that have taken advantage of workers. Who I really want to press us to find a way forward there. And I guess I would say we know the history of the academy. Ursula sort of flagged it, which is that the academy is riddled with the bodies of vulnerable communities in the name of research, right? Literally riddled with those bodies. But before I go into detail, and I won't go into much, I'll say just a bit about my background because it sort of shapes how I think about this. So I'm an anthropologist by training. Before I got my PhD, I was involved in social movement work, primarily the intersection between technology and urban communities and social movements, and particularly poverty. And that really shaped how I did my research from the beginning. I always felt like my research questions were more accountable to the communities I was working with than they were to sets of questions that the academy had set out, that anthropology might have set out. That the questions I was seeking to figure out came from a dialogue with communities, community members, organizers, and that really changed my perspective on what research means and how it operates. And I guess I'll say, building on that, more recently, I've been doing work on platform economy, but more importantly also, or not more importantly, more specifically on academic labor. And I've also now, as Ursula flagged, a leader of academic unions in the US. And so again, those questions come to play about where your sets of concerns are, and how you navigate your concerns with your goals of trying to also transform, in this case, the extreme contingency of most workers in higher ed academic labor in the US, mostly adjunct faculty, but that's a different set of questions. So, but I guess I say this to say that how we approach the work is really important in understanding who we're committed to and what our commitments are. And so this has brought me to a schematic I sort of played with in the article that we worked on for this great special issue on extractive versus symbiotic research, right? And so I'll just flag some of that really briefly, and then I'll just talk about some of the problems we're facing, and then I'll kick it to James and Yassine. But basically, our research can either be research that builds for and with communities, or it will be extractive of those communities. And it's really hard to navigate a line that's not one or the other. And so symbiotic research, I think, tends to ask questions that support and build with the communities you're doing research on, right? They tend to force you to ask, who am I accountable to in my research? Who am I going to report back to when I finish my research? Am I only going to do some interviews and then write a fancy journal article and never come back to the communities that I got the information from? Am I not going to bring my research back to those communities? Is my research not for and with those communities? And again, I think it's more complicated than that, and Fair Work has shown that it can be more complicated than that. But I do think asking those questions before we go into the field is critical. I mean, I'm an ethnographer, so my relationship to quote subjects is very intimate, and really thinking through what your relationship to those folks is really critical to being able to do research that's meaningful. And I think having that at the front of your mind in creating more symbiotic forms of research is really critical. I do want to also flag the majority of research, which is extractive. And I just outlined before we got on today 3 different forms, and this is in no way exhaustive, but just as a beginning of thinking through different forms of extractive research. And the one and most simple is when we're out in the field, we're not thinking about the communities we're working with. We're taking information from them, and then we're moving it back into academic communities, but there's no actual relationship between us and the vulnerable workers that we're doing research on. It's as simple, and I think we all struggle with that, but I think it's one form. But there's 2 others that are much more dangerous. The first is what I'm calling for the short-term substitutism, usually comes from leftist scholars who are doing workers' inquiry and the like, that think that they are of the community they're researching, and then begin to substitute themselves for that community. They become the workers. They use their social, cultural, political capital to win powerful relationships within the organizations of those workers. And it's a problem. It's a problem in the US. It's certainly a problem in the UK. It's certainly a problem around the globe, and one that, again, those of us who are scholars need to think very critically about. And then the last piece of sort of extractive research I'll flag is corporate aligned research. And we just saw it in the bombshell yesterday that Uber, had hundreds of thousands of pounds that was going to researchers in a research fund so that they would produce research that was Uber aligned, right? And we saw it in the US, Cornell's School of Labor and Industrial Relations. They basically bought and paid for a research project on Seattle Uber drivers' wages, where Uber determined what the data set would be. And the scholars basically obscured a huge number of incredibly important contextual issues in order to make an argument that people who are making below the minimum wage in the US were actually doing pretty well by standards. So those are 3 different forms. And I think we, again, to return to this, we have to figure out a better way of policing the boundaries here. Because in the US, the only place where boundaries on ethics is policed is institutional review boards. I'm not sure exactly how it works in the UK, but these IRBs are run by our universities, and they primarily are concerned with litigation, right? They're worried about being sued by people who are taking advantage of. They're not worried about the ethics of research. And so it brings me back to this question: how do we, scholars, support workers who are taken advantage of, and how do we set the right kind of ethical parameters, as Fair Work has done, to make sure that we're not doing it ourselves? So I don't have answers to those questions, but I think they're important issues for us to bring up, and I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to hand over. I'm going to introduce you together. We're so lucky to have with us Yassine Aslam and James Farah from the App Drivers and Couriers Union, who were the two workers who actually had the courage to take Uber to court back in 2016 and have been on a very long journey since then and have built up an amazingly strong and rapidly growing union against considerable odds. So I think Yassine is speaking first. Over to Yassine.
Firstly, I want to say thank you to you, Osla, and also it's great to be here with Todd. So I know today's session is more about academics and research, but I just want to say right at the start that there are a lot of good academics out there, and I have a lot of good friends in the academic field here, like Mark Graham from Fair Work Project, yourself, Todd, and so many others. So it's not like but there are some really bad apples. And myself, because I've been organizing since 2014, I had a lot of bad experience in terms of academics and the way I experienced myself. So just to give the listeners a background, I actually started working for Uber in 2013. I was a private hire driver. So basically I used to work for a cab company. In 2006, I started. So when Uber come into the market, I joined them. I started organizing Uber drives in 2014. And don't forget, when you look at the platform workers, majority of these workers are BME community. These are the very people that Uber themselves used to say that, it's difficult to unionize. And I spent a lot of time back in 2014 talking to academics. And a lot of it, like looking back now, was actually research done by Uber, or they're funded by Uber. And the purpose, like what disheartened me when I used to see these reports back in 2014 is more about how Uber created these opportunities for these low-skilled BME workers, and they're creating these jobs. And it seemed like my voice got drowned in the process, so it was like a rigged kind of stuff. But now I didn't know what my rights are, what I could do, what I signed up to. So, like that was a different kind of stuff then. But then over the years, as we were fighting Uber, we come across different academics. You got different kind of people come into this kind of space to talk about it. And what we started seeing was a different kind of group of people come in. And I'm just talking about the handful of you, like where they were trying to hijack your movement, etc. And I'll just go into some of it. Like what you got to remember is we're talking about platform workers. And like I said, majority of them are from BME workers. Already they're in some kind of financial difficulty. They're struggling to make ends meet. They have families. And the last thing they want to do is put their neck on the line, like risk their job. So they're scared of going to protest, they're scared of joining trade unions. So one of the biggest trust that they need is trust. So when they're talking to an academic for research, you expect that you're, like they're going to keep all that data anonymous, they won't disclose who you are, that kind of stuff. So, it's a bit like where the workers don't want the report going back to their bosses that Yassine said this, he said that. So basically the next day the boss calls you and you're fired. So it's the same kind of stuff. But anyway, just going back, because I don't want to take too much time. So myself, personally, I had a lot of, I'll just talk about one particular thing. Like, for example, there's a report or co-written report which myself and Jamie Woodcock. So I had some bad experience where, like we agreed to write a book, but I withdrew from it because of the way he behaved towards me. And it's all about him and trying to take everything out from me. So over the years, I wrote many notes and stuff, which I handed over, which was my precious kind of life, which I'd given over to someone, and I didn't receive the benefit back. Not that I wanted like any financial benefit, but over the years, what I'm seeing is someone taking credit for my work and promoting himself, whether it's a career advantage or whether it's a financial kind of benefit. And the point is, for me, is how do I withdraw from it? How do I get back my life when someone's claiming to take credit for the work I, like done over the years in terms of collecting that note, in terms of my campaigns and stuff like that. But yeah, so I think one of the problem we're also seeing is when academics are painting themselves as trade unions and organizers coming into the work sectors, trying to get close to you, and then taking that work back, or your notes and your experience or your campaign or organizing effort, and then using it as, you know, like that's their research, but really is the workers. Is the worker that made you stratified. Is the worker that put his neck on the line, and they're able to use all that as their kind of stuff. But the next thing is, it's not just about platform workers. As I mentioned earlier on, it's very hard to organize platform worker, trying to get them to unionize. But when you got such people then coming into trade unions, and the only reason why they're there is to attract their research and pretending to be, you know, like trade unions, it's a problem, because how do these workers have a voice? How do they freely organize? So we had similar experience at, we had similar experience at the IWGB, where, you know, we split and we broke away, but a lot of it was to do with bad ethnical researchers in there, which sort of came to the fact where, you know, we had to make sure the workers own that movement, and it was run by workers. But anyway, I'm just going to give it to Jane. But I think one of the biggest things is, whether you're in a trade union, whether you're a university, there needs to be, academics need to really declare the conflict of interest, which is not really happening. So again, like I mentioned, Jamie Woodcock, like you see him writing reports, he's an organizer at IWGB. So those kind of stuff, they need to be declared. You can't be promoting a union and saying, this is my research and I've got nothing to do with it, when really you're involved in the university. But anyway, over to James, and I'm happy to answer any questions that.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Ursula, for organising this, and thanks to Nelly, Funda, and Todd, and Yassine for some great presentations. I'll try to be brief also. I think I would just underscore what Yassine has said. You know, there's a real importance between that old saying that, you know, being able to distinguish between being in the stands and playing on the field. You can't do both, I think, as a researcher, which is a really important principle. And the first violation, we've seen that today in The Guardian, where Uber is funding research to generate the results they want. I mean, and even if an academic could say, I've got the best integrity, the best code of ethics in the world, you can't escape the fact that when Uber is paying for something, they're paying for something for a reason. And that's hugely problematic. But it also works the other way. When academics enter into our struggle as workers, it is our struggle as workers. We're trying to empower workers. We're trying to give a democratic voice to workers. And what we have seen in some of the independent unions, perhaps like IWGB, is an entry of academics into that field to take up democratically elected positions and then drive the union. And then that creates a democratic deficit, which is, I think, what Yassine is ultimately saying is what happened for us, because we were pushing democratic reform within that union, and got crushed, sued, and defamed and smeared ever since. And so it's most unfortunate, but I think the problem has been there as a democratic deficit. You have to empower the workers, put the workers front and center. And anybody who wants to come in to that field and support it is welcome, but they need to strengthen the voice of workers, not capture the voice of workers, is what I would say. The final thing I would say is that I thought Funda's presentation was really interesting around this area of anonymity, but I think it still comes back. That's a really important hygiene factor, protecting your sources like a journalist would. But the issue is, and I think this is a perennial problem, and I think, you know, I think Fair Work have done a good job of being very thoughtful about it and been very receptive to some of the issues we've raised. But the issue is that how do you observe an environment without becoming part of the environment or affecting that environment? And so when we look at the ratings, and some of the issues that we've raised is, should Fair Work be passing comment on the fairness of a contract that's in litigation and in dispute in the current situation? I'm not sure. We've had a really lively exchange with Fair Work about it. The other issue I would raise with Fair Work is that, is it right for Fair Work to set up two separate ratings for Uber, one for its delivery business and one for its driver business? We say this is one company. That's Uber's model, to separate those things out in that way. And we say that's wrong. Uber presents itself to the financial market, to other stakeholders, as one unified company with these discrete lines of business. And we should hold them to account. We shouldn't allow Uber to be rated on a dual workforce like that. We should demand a common standard for your driver, courier, and so on. So these are kind of the issues that, and there's no doubt fair work is a massive force for good in this field, but these are the ethical issues. And I'm sorry, I don't have the answer for fair work and for funded, but these are important issues, I think, for consideration when you're researching and publishing about live struggles, where there's live litigation, live disputes, is how do you write something, and should you become part of the struggle, or should you observe it from afar? I'm not sure what the right answer is. I better stop there because I know we've all been talking a long time. Thank you, Ursula.
Thanks very much, James. Now, before I throw it open to questions, I think it's only fair to give the three academic speakers a brief chance to come back. So let's do it in order. Nelly, do you want to comment on any of Yassine and James's remarks?
Thank you so much about your comments. I think the only thing I would like to say is that from my perspective, at least, I think one of the issues that researchers can contribute is to discuss a little bit the voices of people who are not actually unionized. And I think this is an interesting exchange that we might have. And especially from a gender perspective, this is really important because we are talking about a lot of sectors that do not involve labor union organizations. I mean, we have, for example, crowd work platforms where people are just isolated in their houses, and it's really difficult to bring them together. We have work that is being carried out in private spaces, so it's difficult to bring workers together. So I think that from my perspective, I think it's quite interesting to work together to discuss a little bit what's happening outside the labor unions and how perhaps work together to think of the ways in which we can bring people in the struggles in more active ways, rather than having these antagonisms about who controls the labor struggles, which for me, the response to that is quite obvious. Obviously, the workers should control the labor struggles. No, it's not our place here to do that or antagonize workers or take their place or whatever. And thank you very much for your contributions.
Thanks. Funda, do you have any points that you'd like to make?
Yes, thank you so much, Yassine and James, for that intervention, and Todd for your comments. I'll respond directly to the points made about fair work. I mean, first of all, thank you very much for your ongoing engagement with us. It's really valuable to us, and as you know, we always welcome all sorts of feedback from workers and unions, and we are not party to any particular union or work group, neither in the UK nor anywhere else that we have research teams. The important thing to mention perhaps is that workers and unions have been part of the development of our principles of the fair contracts principle. And our goal is to do research that benchmarks practices and policies against these principles that were co-developed with the workers. But we don't unilaterally come up with the principle. And perhaps the most important thing to say is that we do not consider our principles to be the ultimate benchmarks. We call them, yes, they're called fair contracts principle, but even if a platform gets both of the points, we consider them as the basic minimums for ensuring decent work standards in the platform economy. They're not the sort of the utmost standard. So there might be ongoing litigation, but the important thing is that these are the basic minimums, and hopefully the standards we see go beyond the minimum. Another important thing to mention is that we don't take funding from companies, and our research is entirely, that's how we ensure our independence from from companies when we release our ratings. And it's a very tricky position. It just means that we work on a very vulnerable timeline too. We work on a research budget basis. But it's very important for us to keep that objectivity, to keep that independence. And that independence also allows us the platform to engage with workers and to hear their voices. And as you know, we always welcome criticisms. I mean, Fair Work principles are not set in stone. We constantly update them. We constantly hear based on the feedback we get from the field work that we do. We are always in a process, engaged in a process of updating them and making sure that the kind of vulnerabilities we hear from the field are translated to our principles, and that the basic minimums that we're setting are based on that kind of feedback.
Great, thanks very much, Funda. Sorry to rush you, but we've got very little time left. Todd, do you want to quickly say something, or should we?
I'll just say one real quick thing, and this is both to James's queries and also back towards the researchers who are speaking, is there is no comfortable place here, right? James, first of all, scholars cannot extract themselves and not impact a terrain, right? Ethnographers in particular are called participant observation. It's called, because you're in the field and you want to learn from the field. So you are in that way, you must impact the field, right? You are not and cannot extract yourself. But I would say also, so that's like one part, and we should take that on ourselves. But also that means our research is not in some way clear of the power that Uber and other corporations have to structure the field, which is a point you made, which is Uber has made an argument about, distinguishing between two parts of its workforce. And we as scholars have to at least scrutinize that. We may agree with it or may not, but we have to scrutinize it because they are the ones that create the terrain on which we all then do research. So there's no objective place out of that. And we should all be honest with that. And also, again, I would say, police our boundaries much better than we have, particularly, well, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Now, can I hand over to Eve, who I hope has been keeping an eye on? Please put up your hand, symbolically put up your hand if you have a short question or comment to make. But I will leave it to Eve to field these because I can't see who's got a hand up and who hasn't.
Hi, Ursula. So we've got one hand up from Brian. Okay, so hey. Brian, there we go.
Hi, thank you. This has been a great discussion. I have a question for Yassine and James. First, thank you so much for discussing some of the things that you've experienced and working with researchers and particularly in the setting to name names. I think is a really important step. Can you maybe give a little bit of like a best practices, maybe like as platform workers, what would you want to see in working with researchers to establish that trust and to know that you can work comfortably with scholars and what should scholars do first to gain that trust, but to then produce ethical research that's of use to movements?
Thanks. Yassine, would you like to take that one, or James? Can I leave it to you to decide who comes back on that one?
Could we both answer it? I could start off and James could finish off.
Yeah, I'll just use a bad tech analogy. Move fast, but don't break anything. How about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same, Brian. Look, I have some good friends, and like I said, sometimes I could pick up the phone and ring certain people like Todd and get some advice, because these are people that come from that background, like they have all that research and they're helpful to workers when they're organizing. But when they're hijacking, that's a completely different. But when they're working there in support as friendship, trying to help these workers go forward and empowering them, that's what you need. So I understand they need to be in the field. So I just gave you an example. For example, J.B. Woodcock, like let's say he did this research, even if he stole my work, whatever, he wrote articles, he's going, let's say he's at University of California or University of Cambridge or wherever. The point is, like he's promoting himself, cashing in, but at the same time, he's also a rep at and on the National Executive Committee at the IWGP that was suing my union, suing James, myself, and other officials, you know, how does that work? How could, like, let's say, Brian, yourself, you're doing research on me, but at the same time, you're also suing me, which is stopping me from organizing. So that boundary you guys need to set. Like, for example, because it doesn't concern you, that means you call it. Because forget what happened to poor Yassine, forget what happened to ADC, that's not our problem. The point is, how do you make sure that people don't do this? You know, how do you make sure that that vulnerable worker is not being pushed even further? So that's something for you guys to consider. But like I said, it's also important to have that relationship, but I just don't know where the boundaries are. You know, they are being abused, and there's a problem there.
Thank you.
Eve, do we have, well, I think we have time for one other quick question. Do we have anyone else with their hand up?
Not yet. So yeah, if anyone has got another question, we've got time, so please put your hand up.
Because if not, what I'd like to do, feel free to interrupt me if a question comes in, is first I'd like to thank you all for coming. It's quite a challenge when you've got a global readership to find a time to hold these things. It's the crack of dawn for Todd in the Rocky Mountains, and it's the evening for Nellie in Athens. And future events we might have at different times of the day, simply to be more sort of globally inclusive. But could I ask any of you who are interested in staying part of this community and helping us build future events and future special issues of the journal to take these debates forward, to consider becoming members? We've got a membership scheme now to substitute for our old subscription scheme, and there will be a link. Eve, I'm sure, will put up a link to tell you how to join and become a member of the Work Organization, Labour and Globalization community. I think I see another hand up, maybe.
Yeah, that's right, another hand from Josie, so I'll ask Josie to unmute now.
Hello, this is actually a question for Nellie. It's really about, you've spoken so interestingly about the gender issues, and I just wondered if you think there's a single thing that might help in that area.
I think it's rather complicated. I don't think it's a single thing that might help in that area, but I think the most important move that we have to make is to change our perspective and somehow try to look at gender issues as being central to how platforms are operating right now. And I think, for example, issues that have to do with private time, private spaces, affective labor should really be integrated, not only in our research, but also in labor practices. For example, when we were doing our research in London and in Paris, we saw that many male Uber drivers were talking about fatherhood. It's a really important issue for them. It's not just, you know, a secondary issue. It's important for them to somehow manage to combine fatherhood with driving. And algorithms would not let them do that because they would keep pressuring them to work constantly, to be exhausted, to be working all the time. So I think integrating gender issues is about asking different questions somehow, or including different questions in both our research and our practices. And I'm not trying to be didactic here. I'm just saying things that come out of research when you ask different questions.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you so much.
I think there is another question, Ursula.
Ursula, I think, has frozen.
Yep, we have a question from Surja, who is here. So Surja.
Suraj, it's Suraj.
Sorry, apologies.
No worries. It was very interesting panel, and I'm really glad that I was part of it. I'm a final year PhD student at SOAS, working on Amazon warehouse labor in India. And during my field work, I sort of, I went with this idea of, trying to understand the labor control mechanisms inside their warehouses. And then my sort of, ended up finding how networks of caste and migrants also sort of affects the way sort of these labor is controlled inside the warehouses, which are their workplaces. So I was wondering, along with gender, do we also sort of try to bring into these additional intersectional aspects? Because when it comes to India, the low caste laborers and especially migrant laborers, so it's a combination of three things. You have to have a low caste person and young laboring body who have been benefited with the positive state action, so that you can read English and then become part of this so-called gig economy and platform work, and also warehouse labor. And secondly, you also sort of see these are the people who are looking for better life, and Amazon sort of work inside India offers a better life for them. And do we also sort of think of those options maybe, and how do we handle those intersectional aspects? I would just it's an open question to everyone.
Sorry, I got locked out of the meeting for a little while then, so I missed the beginning of that question.
Hello, is it my network or something?
No, I think it's Ursula.
Ursula's, yeah, has a.
Okay.
So she seems to have rejoined the meeting. Ursula, can you hear us?
Maybe we can all respond to this question.
Yeah, that's okay too.
Maybe James and Yassine, do you want to start or?
Could you summarize the question again, Suraj? I've just got mixed up as we.
Hi, James. It was really nice to hear you and your other speakers. It was interesting. The ethical dilemmas are real, and I think we really need to tread that path very carefully. While I was doing my fieldwork, I sort of actually took up a job, worked with my colleagues, and try to understand how it was happening. And my own positionality was also someone coming from the similar background. My life has been like this. My brother works there, so all of it's class and even caste and all sort of angles. But my interesting insight from the research was, in addition with the gender is sort of one marker. But in addition with the gender, there are other markers. Like in India, we have caste, which is a quite dominant sort of a form of oppression that we see. And within these platform workers, like in developed world, we call BME people getting sort of exploited into these circuits. But in India, we have low caste and also migrant sort of circuits, migrant young laborers. So apart from gender, how do we sort of extend it to these categories as well, and how do we frame it? Because I was thinking it also is substantially decides what levels of control that they can exercise on you, depending on whether you're native, not, all of that. So yeah, fairly.
Well, I can give a quick answer to that, and I think this, we have to be very careful that in our research, we don't start to replicate the problems of power in the outside world. So, again, what we've seen in unions like the WGB when we were there is that a lot of the power was concentrated in a very white middle class group. And it's very important, again, that the power in the structure of the union reflects the membership body of the union. If we're not empowering the workers, I'm not sure that we're achieving anything very much. But Yassine, this is more, you probably have a lot more to say about this.
Sorry, go ahead. I missed that bit, James.
Oh.
Suraj was reflecting on, what are the different markers, perhaps, of discrimination and gender, but also in India, a lot of different castes. And I was just saying that it's very important that the structure and power in a union reflects truly the face of the workers. And in
Right.
London, for us, it's 94% BME. That's a huge majority of people in minority.
Yeah, so I sort of come from a similar background to you, Sujad. I come from Pakistan, and I understand the caste system. We have something similar, and unfortunately, like the problem we get, and I see this even within the academic kind of field as well. The question is like, how do universities also make sure that there is no such discrimination where all the academics are given the same kind of access to workers? But the main thing when we're talking about workers, what James highlighted is, especially when we're talking about platform workers, is the majority of them are BME. And one of the things that we're dealing with and never gets covered is the discrimination. For example, the discrimination they're faced by the app, discrimination they're faced by the regulators. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that needs to be done in this bill, but it's not really highlighted at the moment. And most stuff that we talk about is the pay, which is quite important as well. And also, especially in the case of Uber, is the unfair dismissal kind of stuff where workers are worried about losing their job.
Mm-hmm.
Apologies, everybody. My Wi-Fi went down. Terrible timing for about 5 minutes. I've only just got back in again. I see that the discussion is continuing after the 6 o'clock deadline, which is really nice. Is there anyone else who wants to contribute anything, or is it time to wrap up? Eve, do we have anyone else who, with their hand up?
No, I think we can wrap up now. I haven't got any more hands up.
Well, in that case, let me thank you all very much for your interesting contributions, including those that I didn't hear, and hoping to see you again on future occasions like this. It seems to me it's really it's really useful to have discussions like this and to build networks and to build debates. I hope it may have encouraged some of the academics in this audience to contribute articles to future issues. And I hope it may have convinced anybody who isn't an academic that that these are lively debates. There isn't a foregone single way of doing academic research on platform work, and it's really worth engaging with scholars, especially the new generation of younger scholars coming through, so we can start to develop better practices and better ways of being attentive to each other and of protecting the interests of vulnerable workers and furthering furthering the causes that they're involved in. And let me end by pleading with you to become members of Work Organisation, Labour and Globalisation, if that's what you'd like to do. These webinars are free and our articles are free to read, but we will be dependent on some income in order to survive in the future. So if you can afford a few dollars to become a member or persuade your employer to do so, then we'd be really very interested. So thank you again to all our wonderful speakers. Take care.